Saturday, January 6, 1945, the USS Columbia, along with other ships, was conducting shore bombardments in the Lingayen Gulf. They were there in support of the Allied liberation of the Philippine island of Luzon, the largest and most important of the island chain. Scheduled shore bombardments went off as planned. Just before noon, as minesweeping efforts began, so did the Japanese counterattack. They sent a constant stream of kamikazes to disrupt the invasion. For 6 hours, the suicide planes frantically attacked the fleet. Late in the afternoon, a plane appeared skimming the waves, moving at tremendous speed. Scrambling to meet the threat, all of Columbia's guns were trained on the target. The plane appeared to be hit and climbed, but then suddenly turned and dived. My dad, John Winston Bramblett, died Saturday, September 24, 1977. He was 53 years old. I was 9. He exists in my conscience like a background noise, sometimes so quiet I almost can't hear it, and louder at other times. Right after he died, I wanted to remember what he sounded like, remember his voice. Try as I might, I could not keep that memory. To this day, I recall the shock I felt when, a few months after his death, I could no longer remember what he sounded like. The images stuck, though. The fox hunts he took me on, the smell of his cigarettes heavy in the air. Dad was not well for several years before he died, so him and Mom took to sleeping in separate beds. I was scared of the dark as a young child and would often sleep with my mom. Sometimes I'd wake up thirsty and she'd take me to the kitchen for a drink of water. It must have been 2 or 3 in the morning, and the way to the kitchen I'd see the outline of Dad, sitting in his chair, the fire of his cigarette glowing orange in the dark, smoke heavy in the air. Why would he be out of bed in the middle of the night, I wondered. It seemed strange to me, but this was a common occurrence. Looking back on it now with adult understanding, I'm convinced he was having nightmares. The kind of nightmares that don't go away. They keep coming back again and again and again. The result of deep trauma. But it was the 1970s and folks just didn't talk about problems as a result of war. War was a glorious thing. His generation had won World War II, for God's sakes. I may be reading too much into these episodes, but I think not. I was too young to understand why he was out of bed. I suspect he didn't understand it either. Since Dad died when I was so young, I didn't know him on adult terms. And there's not that many living memories still around. There are hints about his personality, though. His name inscribed on the building committee plaque of the Cedar Creek Baptist Church. Memories of him collecting petition signatures to get the roads paved. His love of fox hunting. But this was a time when he had diminished. After suffering multiple heart attacks, he had to take it easy. I'm curious about his life as a young man. What were his formative years like? There's very little to go on, but the blurry picture that forms is one of a young man trying desperately to find his way in the world. I've worked on getting a clearer picture of his life through one of its most significant periods, his time spent on board the USS Columbia during World War II. He never talked about that time. In fact, he refused to do so even when pressed. The fact he refused to talk about it speaks to the trauma it caused him. For me, however, Since that time is so well documented, it serves as an invaluable window into his experiences through the shared experiences of the ship's crew. Dad's formal education ended in the sixth grade out of necessity. He needed to go to work. His father, my grandfather, had died in 1939 when Dad was 14 years old. Dad's younger brother had died 4 years before that. This left my dad as the only male in the family and one of the providers for his mother and sisters. It was sometime around the fall of 1943 to January 1944, with World War II in full swing, when the military came calling. If it was required, Dad wanted to be in the Army, but Uncle Sam had other ideas. According to family lore, when the officer told him he was in the Navy, Dad replied, "The hell I am," to which the officer responded, "The hell you are." The first photo I have of him during this period was taken on January 26, 1944, with his basic training unit stationed in Chicago. The city must have been quite a change for him, considering he was a farm boy from rural Georgia. He was there for 4 months. The last photo of him in Chicago was taken in May, and that's where the trail goes cold for his individual story, and where the ship's story begins for our purposes. The crew of the USS Columbia, nicknamed the Gem, was already well seasoned when the ship docked at Hunters Point, San Francisco for maintenance on June 3, 1944. They had been through the Solomon Islands campaign, they had survived dive bomber attacks, been in the Battle of Rennell Island during the Guadalcanal campaign, where they shot down multiple enemy planes, conducted shore bombardments all over the Solomon Islands chain and surrounding islands since December 1942. While supporting the Bougainville landings, the Battle of Empress Augusta Bay took place. They distinguished themselves in that battle by participating in sinking 2 Japanese cruisers. They were veterans. Dad's family were sharecroppers, scratching out a living from the hard red Georgia clay using plows pulled by mules. It's the only life he had ever known. He was sent up to Yankee country. Civil War speak was still common, to Chicago for training. He spent most of this initial period here, learning the nuts and bolts of how to be a sailor. Leaving Chicago, the Navy sent him to San Francisco. He was now poised to board a warship bound for the Pacific Theater. He had traveled more in 6 months than he had his entire life up to that point. This was typical of soldiers and sailors of the period, but it doesn't make it any less dramatic. Laying eyes on the Columbia for the first time, it's difficult to imagine Dad not being at least slightly impressed by the size of it. From his vantage point, it must have looked huge. She was 610 feet long, about as long as 1.5 football fields, and 66 feet wide. Her crew consisted of 70 officers and 1,285 enlisted men. The Columbia was the second ship produced in the Cleveland class of light cruisers. Light is not an accurate description. These were the largest and heaviest cruisers ever built. They were brimming with firepower. Practically every inch of deck space was dedicated to some kind of gun. President Roosevelt himself had ordered that the ships be as heavily armored as possible, to which the designers had gladly obliged. In fact, part of the problem with the Clevelands, from a design perspective, was that they had so much armament that it made them slightly top-heavy. All those guns also meant that they couldn't be upgraded without disarming first, and that was a drawback too. But in total, the Cleveland class of light cruisers were some kick-ass ships. A total of 27 were made, and none of them were sunk. The big 5 and 6-inch guns had the latest radar targeting systems. This would prove crucial in the months ahead. Dad did reveal that his job was to pass shells to someone. This is a vague description. I really wanted to understand what his role was, so I dug deep into how a 5 and 6-inch triple gun turret worked. This will get a bit technical because this detail is important to his story. I don't think he was in the 5-inch guns, because that one was mainly automated and there wasn't anyone passing shells to someone else in that gun's operational specifications. But the 6-inch gun required two passing operations. One was in the turret itself. I can't specifically rule out that this was his workstation, but it just doesn't fit the stories, because they put him down in the ship. This is where the other handling operation occurred. There was a projectile flat on the second deck just under the 6-inch turret. They called it a projectile handling room. This is where I believe Dad worked. He was one of the men working in the projectile handling room. I think he was one of 4 projectile passers. He took the shells off the rack and handed them to the projectile loader, who put the shells on the hydraulic lift that took it up to the turret. He was one of the men feeding the ever-hungry guns. This is an important point. Notice where he was in the ship, where he spent his workday. Notice how tight and cramped the space was. Notice that, if the ship was seriously damaged, it was difficult to get out. The 6-inch guns could maintain a sustained rate of fire of 8 to 10 rounds per minute. How long this rate of fire could be sustained was directly determined in part by how fast the gun crews could work. Each shell weighed between 105 to 120 pounds and had to be manhandled to get them to the guns. Often, after a prolonged bombardment operation, there were broken hands and feet. If anyone got tired, injured, or slowed down at all, so too did the gun's rate of fire. Understand that slowing down how fast the gun shoots is not good when everyone's life is hanging in the balance. A crucial part of this story is what gun turret Dad worked on. I don't know if he worked on the forward or aft guns. I'm going to imagine him working in the aft section of the ship, assigned to the 2nd Division, stationed in turret number 3. But this is pure speculation on my part. Dad joined the Columbia crew in June of 1944 while the ship was docked in San Francisco. With maintenance complete and the ship supplied, they were underway to the war by Thursday, June 29. Life on board the ship must have been a dramatic change for him. The general rule of thumb seems to be the bigger the ship, the nicer the living conditions are. These clips from a naval film about the Clevelands show they had relatively nice facilities.
Below decks, there's a pharmacy or drugstore, just like there is at home. Your ship is home now, to almost 1,000 men. There's a barber shop aboard. And a ship service store or soda fountain for everything from razor blades to ice cream. There's a machine shop for repairs. And always there's plenty for fighting men to eat. Chow in sailor language. Good chow, like thick steaks.
Notice how much space there was, but this was still a warship, and personal comfort was not a priority. Personal space was cramped, and in some cases, pretty much non-existent. There's very little video available of the cruiser's living conditions, but there's a lot about life on board a destroyer that I think gives a flavor of what it was like. I imagine that it was sometimes preferable, and maybe more comfortable, when possible to sleep out on deck or at your station rather than in the crew quarters. It was cramped below deck in those areas. Just getting to the bathroom, also known as the head, could trip you up. The head was one of the more challenging places. There was always 8 or 10 naked guys around you. Forget about privacy, but still bathing and bowel movements had to be done. And it gave some men a chance to show off their body art. The food got mixed reviews. Some liked it, and others decidedly did not. It seemed to be the lack of variety that was the most troublesome. But fighting forces run on their stomach and had to be fed. Every meal, regardless if it was breakfast, lunch, or dinner, was called chow. There was always coffee available, 24 hours a day. I think this is where Dad picked up the habit of always having a pot of hot coffee on the stove until he died. The officers lived in much better conditions. They had more privacy and better food. Their chow was served to them by orderlies on china plates. They ate with sterling silver utensils, arranged on linen napkins and tablecloths. Fancy. One thing everyone had in common was the heat. They were in the tropics and it was hot and humid. When the ship was moving along at a decent clip on open, smooth water, they could catch a breeze on deck. But at other times, when the ship was going slow, the heat was oppressive. All those previous clips neglected an important point. The ship was constantly pitching and rolling to some extent. Take all those activities we just saw and throw in that kind of motion. I figured there was a lot of, at least for the first part of the voyage, especially for the new guys like Thad, at least until they got their sea legs. After leaving the west coast, they headed for the Solomon Islands. Dad crossed the equator into the southern hemisphere for the first time on Tuesday the 22nd of August, 1944, at exactly 12:03 in the afternoon. A few days later, Thursday, August 24th, they anchored in Purvis Bay. Dad was now in the Pacific Theater. He had turned 20 years old on the voyage. They had traveled approximately 6,200 miles since leaving San Francisco on June 29th. In less than 2 weeks, the Gem was at war. They were immediately assigned to Task Group 32.5 and were underway by Wednesday, September 6th. Their mission was to support the attack and capture of the Palau Island chain. In particular, the islands of Angar and Palau were deemed important. The U.S. could use airfields there to protect MacArthur's right flank during the upcoming Philippines invasion.
When we left the Solomons, we still didn't know where our next stop was, but it was getting closer. And when we got there, somebody was going to be shooting at us.
All hands, all hands. Now hear this. The objective of this task force is the Palau Islands, 8 degrees north of the equator and 530 miles east of the Philippines. By occupying these islands, we will complete the sealing off of the important Jap strongholds to the east, Truk, Ponape. We'll help protect General MacArthur's right flank when he strikes against the Philippines.
General MacArthur? Back to the Philippines? But what was our job going to be exactly? Angar. That's our job. Southernmost of the Palau group. About 3 square miles of limestone and coral. Japs got a lot of their phosphate here.
The Columbia was assigned to support the landings at Angar. At 4:54 a.m. on Tuesday, September the 12th, it got real. General quarters sounded and everyone went to their battle stations. The bombardment started at 6 a.m. This was Dad's baptism of fire, his first action against the Japanese. Between September 12th to the 19th, they supported the landing operations on the island of Angar. Over that period, they fired 2,221 6-inch rounds. I don't know how strong Dad was at that time, but he had to get strong quick because he was handling a lot of artillery shells. By my calculation, on the order of 140 shells were moved by each projectile passer over that 7-day period. That's about 14,500 pounds of artillery handled by each passer over that week. Welcome to the war, Dad. Despite all the shelling by the ships, there were no enemy troops observed by the scout planes or shore observers. However, the plane spotter did see one horse. Behind this humorous observation of the horse lay a much darker reality. There were in fact 1,400 Japanese troops dug deep into strong defensive positions away from shore. Yet these kinds of reports about not seeing any enemy troops came in from scouts all over the fleet, making their way up to Rear Admiral Jesse Ohlendorf, who in turn reported that the Navy had run out of targets. And he was right in one sense. All the assigned targets in the battle plan had been hit multiple times, but the Japanese had changed tactics from earlier engagements, so rather than fighting heavily on the beaches, they would depend on in-depth defenses farther inland. What had originally been expected to be a 3-day operation to take the Palau Islands turned into a grind. At Angar, This meant it took 10,000 infantry troops of the Army's 81st Division from the 17th of September to the 22nd of October to secure the island. As the Japanese took to the high ground, fighting was so heavy in areas they were given names like Suicide Hill and Bloody Gulch. There were reports that in some cases, where the Japanese had fortified caves and would not surrender, the entrances were simply sealed using bulldozers. There were 260 U.S. soldiers killed and 1,354 wounded, including a regiment commander. In total, it took 73 days to secure the Palau Islands. The heaviest fighting had taken place on the island of Peleliu, just north of Angar. It was the, quote, bitterest battle of the war for the Marines, end quote. This according to the National Museum of the Marine Corps. What was intended to secure the right flank of the Philippine invasion by capturing the Palau Islands was, in hindsight, a mistake. They were never used as intended. Instead, other atolls and islands were used to protect the Philippine invasion. According to Admiral Ohlendorf, quote, if military leaders, and that includes Navy brass, were gifted with the same accuracy of foresight that they are with hindsight, then the assault of Peleliu should never have been attempted. End quote. In the end, the invasion decision was attempted to be salvaged by, quote, lesson learned, end quote, assessments. These lessons would be applied at Okinawa and Iwo Jima. While fighting was still taking place on Angar and Peleliu, the Jim was ordered to Manus Island, arriving on Friday, September 29th at Seidler Harbor. By Saturday, October 7th, the ship had been fully resupplied, fueled to capacity, and temporarily reassigned to the 7th Fleet for duty in Task Group 77.2. Something big was coming. On Thursday, the 12th of October, the task group steamed out of Seidler Harbor. They were headed to Leyte Gulf. The long-awaited invasion of the Philippines had begun. On Sunday, October 15th, they passed within 27 miles of Angar. Fighting to secure the island was still going on. They arrived off the Philippine coast on Tuesday, October 17th, under a stormy sky and a rolling sea. It's believed that the Columbia and her sister ship, the Denver, were the first major U.S. surface ships in visual distance of the Philippine Islands since the Japanese occupation. The Columbia's mission was to cover landings of Army Rangers on the islands at the entrance to Leyte Gulf so they could be secured prior to the invasion fleet entering. The next day, the weather cleared and the landing operations went ahead. Columbia was in the second wave of ships to enter the Gulf. While en route to her assigned position at 4:57 in the afternoon, 2 mines exploded at the stern of the ship and caused no damage. However, I'm sure it got the crew's attention. At dawn on Thursday, she arrived at her assigned station along the coast, just south of a little village named San Jose. Shelling began. Her targets were enemy gun positions along Katmon Hill and the Dulag airfield, and then targets of opportunity along the coast. There was some minor resistance. For example, Columbia received mortar fire from Katmon Hill that was quickly dispatched. On Friday, shelling was ramped up in anticipation of the troop landings. At 8:20 a.m., Columbia's 6-inch guns opened fire in coordination with airstrikes on Katmon Hill. At 9:56, the first troops were storming the beaches. 20 minutes later, again with the mortar fire. 6 shells hit the water off Columbia's port quarter. 6 minutes later, 4 more hit the water in about the same position. This guy was becoming annoying. The mortars were coming from Katmon Hill. So the Jim laid down fire, and the mortars stopped. While dangerous to the exposed crew on deck, mortar fire was not a serious threat to a ship like Columbia. Torpedo planes, however, that's a different matter. All day there were Allied airstrikes taking place on Katmon Hill. The planes were supposed to stay away from the naval fleet. But some of the pilots ignored this instruction. As a result, the ship's spotters had a difficult time telling friend from foe until the plane was almost on top of them. This was an operational problem that had dire consequences. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a Japanese torpedo plane came in from the vicinity of Katmon Hill, flying at top speed at about 50 feet above the water. Once identified as an enemy, the Columbia immediately opened fire and turned toward the plane, so she presented as small a target as possible to the torpedo. Picking another target, the plane launched its torpedo at the USS Honolulu, a ship that had been damaged during the Pearl Harbor attack. The torpedo was launched at about 1.5 miles distance, and the plane strafed with its guns as it pulled away. At 4:02, the torpedo struck, and the Honolulu began listing to port and beached. The Columbia had to break off its bombardment operations to lend aid, sending a medical crew to treat the wounded. At dawn on Saturday, October 21st, observers on board Columbia witnessed a Japanese plane attack and then hit the bridge of the HMAS Australia. The ship's captain, 7 officers, and 23 sailors were killed. Another 60, including a commodore, were wounded. There was some debate if the plane had deliberately hit the ship, but most observers agreed it was intentional. Some military historians believe this marked the beginning of the kamikaze attacks on the Allies. In the following days, Columbia spotters witnessed individual suicide attacks on the USS Denver, Louisville, and California. I came across a report from a veteran of the USS Denver, Columbia's sister ship, of an incident that I think happened during this period. In the heat of battle, sometimes friendly fire accidents occurred. In this case, the Denver's gunners were engaging an enemy plane that was attacking them. They followed it all the way down until it crashed into the ocean, firing at it the whole time. The Columbia was on the other side of the plane across from the Denver's fire. A 40-millimeter round from Denver hit one of the Columbia's crew, killing the sailor instantly, according to this eyewitness. I searched and searched for an independent account of this incident, but I couldn't find one. Friendly fire was always a concern in the confusion of battle. Lieutenant Commander Hall, the GEM's air defense officer, took it as a point of pride that the Columbia never fired on any friendly ships. On Monday the 23rd, at 8:08 a.m., the Columbia was called to provide fire on an enemy troop column estimated at 1,700 strong, proceeding in the vicinity of Taban village. I found this location based on the photo provided in Columbia's battle history book. Its name is Dulag. Columbia's fire was reported to have had, quote, great effect covering the area where the column was located, end quote. Between the 17th and the 24th of October, Columbia remained on call during the day for fire support operations in the area south of Dulag, all the way up to the northern end of Leyte Gulf. At night, she would retire along with the other cruisers and battleships to the northern end of Serigal Strait. They were patrolling for enemy ships that may try to enter Leyte Gulf from the south. It's a good thing they did. Imperial Japan was not going to let the Allied invasion of the Philippines go uncontested for long. This was their main communications and logistical channel between their southern sources of raw materials and the industrial facilities in the home islands. Japan was dependent on this raw material from its southern possessions to fuel the industry needed to supply the war effort. Cutting off those supplies by controlling the Philippines would be a death blow to the Japanese ability to conduct war. In military circles, they knew that if the Philippines fell, the war was lost. This set up a series of battles that would come to be known collectively as the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Some military historians consider it to be the largest naval battle in history. The word epic is appropriate here, because it's hard to describe just how large and widespread this battle was. There were a lot of ships involved over a vast area. It was comprised of 4 separate battles, each one significant in its own right. The Jim participated in the Battle of Saragal Strait. Historically, this battle was the last battleship-on-battleship action in history. It was one of only two battleship versus battleship naval battles in the entire Pacific campaign of World War II, and it was the last battle in which one force, in this case the U.S. Navy, was able to cross the T of its opponent. Crossing the T is the highest tactical maneuver a ship's commander can hope to achieve. The Jim had been providing continuous fire support during the day and patrol during the night since the 17th of October. The crew had lived at their battle stations. They were tired, suffering from significant lack of sleep. Despite the stress, they continued to perform their duties admirably. Continual bombardment was beginning to take its toll on the ship as well. Cracks were forming in bulkheads, weld seams were beginning to split, but nothing serious. The more problematic issue was keeping the ship supplied with ammunition. Resupply was a problem because of the continual threat of Japanese air attack. Fully loaded, the Jim could carry 2,400 rounds of 6-inch shells and 5,000 rounds of 5-inch. In 6 days, from the 19th to the 24th, the Jim had burned through 2,564 6-inch rounds and 3,099 5-inch. That's an average of 427 and 517 rounds respectively per day. The number of shells being spent was exceeding the amount being resupplied. She was beginning to run low on ammunition. On the morning of the 24th, a Japanese naval force approaching Saragal Strait from the south was spotted by U.S. aircraft and attacked with minimal damage to the enemy ships. But their presence was relayed to U.S. command so a reception could be prepared. The U.S. Navy laid a trap such that the Japanese force of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers would have to run a gauntlet of USPT boats and destroyers. Then, at the northern end of the strait, 2 columns of cruisers backed by 6 battleships would be waiting. They were the cross of the T at the top of the column of enemy ships. By late evening of Tuesday, October 24th, the air was heavy with anticipation as the ships took up their station. Columbia was in the left flank of cruisers stationed in front of the battleship line. The destroyers were sent further down the strait, taking up positions on either side. The PT boats were sent to find the Japanese ships. Visibility was good. Temperature was around 80 degrees and the sea was calm, with an occasional thunderstorm popping up in the strait. The stage was set. The crew was served coffee and sandwiches. It was going to be a long night. What follows is the Jim's chronological record of that night. At 11:10 p.m., the PT boats sighted Japanese ships about 50 miles from the mouth of the strait. They identified 3 destroyers and 2 large unidentified vessels. Wednesday the 25th, 12:30 a.m. Several large skunks were reported 8 miles from the entrance to the strait. At 12:43 a.m. Lost contact with the Japanese column. At 2 a.m., the PT boats reported the ships had entered the southern end of the strait. At 2:06, PT boats attacked the Japanese column. At 2:40 a.m., alert all stations, condition I, battle stations. 2:44, destroyers reported contact with the 3 ships. 2 2:57, destroyers reported 5 targets in the column, 2 large and 3 small. Made first destroyer attack on the enemy ships. 3:10, second destroyer attack on the enemy column. 3:13, Columbia picks up the lead ship on radar, range 34,500 yards. Designated target A. 3:14, destroyers report 5 ships, 2 of which appear to be slowing down. 3:19, destroyers report a big fire in one of the enemy ships. 3:23, destroyers report 6 targets, 3 large and 3 small. Columbia begins tracking a second target, designated target B. 3:24, destroyers report enemy size as 2 battleships, 1 or 2 cruisers, and 1 destroyer. Columbia's radar picks up a second group of ships, distance 20 miles. 3:27, destroyers report several hits scored on enemy ships. Second group of ships have reversed course and exited the strait. 3:30, U.S. ships pick up the Japanese command communications circuit. 3:31, PT boats report 3 battleships 10 miles south of his station. Admiral Ohlendorf orders battleships to fire. 3:33, destroyers ordered to attack. 3:43, Columbia observers pick up second large flame and sighted 4 large ships in the glow. 3:46, PT reported 5 enemy destroyers dead in the water. 3:48, Columbia observed 4th large explosion in enemy group. 3:49, Admiral Ohlendorf orders left flank cruisers to open fire. 3:51, Columbia opens with salvos from her 6-inch guns on target A. 3:52, observed 5th large explosion in the enemy group. 3:53, Columbia 6-inch gun shifted to rapid fire. 3:54, Admiral Ohlendorf orders right flank cruisers to open fire. 3:55, Columbia's 5-inch guns open fire on target B. 3:58, multiple explosions were observed from the enemy group. 3:59, Columbia began receiving incoming fire of a large caliber straddling the ship. 6-inch gun shifted to rapid fire. 4:01, large caliber fire was received from the enemy ships. Near misses were observed aft. 4:04, ceased firing of 5-inch guns. 4:07, ceased fire of 6-inch guns. 4:14, 10th large explosion was observed in the enemy ship group. 4:15, target A disappeared from all screens, range 19,000 yards. 4:18, target B disappeared from all screens, range 21,000 yards. .440, destroyers reported the enemy ships that remained were retreating southward in the strait. .503, Columbia's radar begins tracking target C. Increase speed to catch the target. .530, Columbia began firing on target C with her 6-inch guns. Quote, visual observations disclose Columbia salvos to be striking large, burning vessel believed to be a battleship. This ship was completely ablaze and burning worse than the Arizona burn at Pearl Harbor. End quote. .539, Columbia's 6-inch guns cease fire. 5:56, destroyers report numerous survivors in the water. At 6:50, Admiral Ohlendorf ordered Columbia and Denver down the strait to, quote, destroy enemy cripples, end quote. The cruisers were accompanied by a group of destroyers. Ohlendorf further instructed his ships, quote, do not overload your ships with survivors. Search each man well and see that he does not have any weapons. Anyone offering resistance, shoot him. Proceed independently to pick up survivors, end quote. At 7:02, Columbia began tracking an enemy destroyer dead in the water, designated as Target D. It was just over 6.5 miles away. 5 minutes later, she opened fire with her 6-inch guns. After 10 minutes of shelling, she ceased fire. At 7:21, Target D sank. 2 minutes later, she increased speed to 20 knots, headed back to Leyte Gulf. U.S. ships outside the Gulf reported they were under attack by enemy forces. The Columbia was 63 miles away from them. The Japanese center force was attacking from the north, and all remaining Allied ships were diverted to protect the beachhead at Leyte Gulf. They were going to what would become known as the Battle of Sumar, but the Columbia was not part of that mad rush northward because she was out of bullets. There were only 53 6-inch and 200 5-inch shells remaining in her magazines. She was spent. During the battle, she had fired 1,147 rounds of 6-inch and 339 5-inch shells. The loudspeakers blared. Now hear this. Secure from general quarters. Set torpedo defense watch. The other ships in the fleet would have to handle the situation up north, and they did. The Japanese ships were beaten back, and the threat was over. There's a lot to unpack in this episode of the Columbia's life. The sailors didn't know it at the time, but they had just won a major historical battle. Their actions as part of the Battle of Leyte Gulf were hugely significant for the war. Afterward, the Imperial Japanese Navy was so reduced in ships that it was not a significant fighting force for the remainder of the war. In the Battle of Saragasso Strait alone, the Japanese losses were huge. 2 battleships, a heavy cruiser, and 3 destroyers were now resting on the bottom of the strait. On the order of 4,000 Japanese sailors were killed, including their admiral. Very few survived. Burning oil from the sunken ships killed many. About 150 refused to be rescued. Ultimately, only about 20 were plucked from the water. As it turned out, there was no need for concern about overloading the ships with survivors. For the Americans, there were 39 killed and 114 wounded, mostly from the result of friendly fire, and 1 PT boat was sunk. Historically, it was one of the most one-sided naval actions ever. 5 of the U.S. battleships involved had been sunk or badly damaged during the Pearl Harbor attack. Now, they had their revenge. It also marked the end of the naval battle line era, where battleships face off on open water, gun for gun. This type of ship-to-ship fighting had dominated naval warfare for 289 years, beginning in 1655. For the Columbia, she had endured 14 artillery salvos from the enemy ship's 14-inch guns during the battle. The closest shells fell just 50 yards short of the ship. Understand that had the Columbia suffered a hit by one of these 14-inch shells near the waterline, it would have potentially caused her to sink. Although they didn't realize it at the time, the U.S. cruisers had come under torpedo attack by the Japanese cruisers. This information about the torpedo attack wasn't known until after the war. It was learned during interrogations of a torpedo officer who ordered the attack and survived the battle. Remember the radar targeting systems mentioned earlier? The highest-ranking Japanese officer to survive the battle, a destroyer captain, during his interrogation, he was asked his professional opinion regarding the operations in Saragasso Strait. He credited the, quote, efficiency of the American radar control that was far ahead of the Japanese, end quote. partly for the Japanese defeat. But there was no rest for the weary. The Jim headed back north to Leyte Gulf, where she dodged her way through multiple Japanese air attacks. In fact, over the following days, there were so many air raids by Japanese planes, the Jim could not be safely resupplied. Finally, on the 29th of October, the Jim was ordered to Cedar Harbor on Manus Island for what was simply called logistics. There was more going on than just restocking the ammunition stores. Over 6 days, the Columbia's guns had fired about 7,000 rounds of 5 and 6-inch ammunition. During the height of the Sargal Strait battle, the amount of fire coming out of the 6-inch guns was described as continuous, like a continual stream of railroad cars going over a hill. At one point during fighting, Columbia fired 1,147 rounds in 18 minutes, equaling a 12-gun salvo every 12 seconds. If my calculations are right, Dad, along with his shipmates on those guns, were handling a 120-pound armor-piercing round every 15 seconds, all the while taking the incoming fire of the 14-inch enemy rounds, whose nearby explosions were an unwelcome contribution to the maelstrom. Those explosions were close enough to splash the men on deck and shake the core of Columbia. The strain and stresses of firing so much artillery caused further structural damage to the ship. Welded seams had split, bulkheads were blown out, gun mounts were cracked, multiple ruptures in the hull had developed, and electrical fittings had failed. While these things were minor compared to the big picture, it speaks to the magnitude of the event they had gone through. Repairs had to be made to the ship before it was fully ready for battle. Before we move on, I want to pause here and consider the Japanese survivors of the Sargal Strait battle. Let's go back to the morning of October 25th. As dawn broke, there was carnage from the northern to the southern end of Sargal Strait. There must have been Japanese survivors in the water up and down the strait. Some survivors were close enough to shore to swim to it, where their fate was in the hands of the Filipinos, who had no love for them. Other survivors would rather die than surrender, so their fate was in their own hands. In my mind, I can see there was a mixture of reactions from the Japanese in the water. Now consider that the Battle of Samar was beginning. It was a closely run thing for the U.S. because we were outgunned by the Japanese forces. Admiral Halsey had left the back door open when he took the main portion of the U.S. fleet up to meet the Japanese Toothless Tiger of aircraft carriers further north. In short, the fox was in the henhouse. The U.S. ships in that fight were radioing frantically that their situation was critical and calling for aid. At the end of the battle, the Japanese forces were beaten back, but at the cost of 5 U.S. ships sunk and 2,800 casualties. Now, back to the strait and those Japanese sailors in the water. By the accounts I could find, there were on the order of 500 found in the water after their ships were sunk. The accounts also say that most of the Japanese refused to be rescued, and that for those that made it to shore or close to shore, they were killed by the Filipinos. That's the official accounts anyway, and there's no reason to doubt it, but I don't think it tells the whole story. I also came across one other account from a sailor who served on the USS Boise and explains in more detail what happened, as relayed by his son years later. Quote, "The water was full of Japanese survivors. We received orders to pick up 7 alive for questioning and kill the rest, and that's exactly what we did. The ships lined up in formation and did crisscross patterns through them. We machine gunned them. Destroyers rolled depth charges. I don't feel too good about it." End quote. The son asked how he rationalized that event, and the sailor, now aged, said, quote, "It was war. They would have done the same to us." End quote. I think more context needs to be added. The situation in the Pacific Theater was such that both Allied and Japanese attitudes of surrender were fluid at best. On the Japanese side, they considered surrender dishonorable. They even had a code of conduct that included a prohibition against being taken prisoner. The Japanese government issued propaganda that celebrated people who fought to the death rather than surrender. On the Allied side, they sought to treat those who surrendered in accordance with international agreements on the treatment of POWs. But still, they were reluctant to take prisoners, because often the surrender was a ploy to lure Allied troops into an ambush or booby trap. But the Allies needed information from these POWs, and they were no use dead. In fact, the Allied forces in May of 1944 had to implement educational programs aimed at changing this attitude of kill 'em all. It was, in fact, fear of being killed during or after surrendering that was one of the main factors which influenced Japanese troops to fight to the death. This was the situation the sailors found themselves in on the morning of October 25, 1944. The U.S. forces were still under attack on the northern end of Leyte Gulf. They were needed urgently elsewhere. Those Japanese sailors floating on the water had been eagerly trying to kill them a few hours earlier. Taking such a large number of Japanese survivors on board already cramped ships where they could cause damage to the ship and harm the crew was incredibly risky. So the sailors, under orders, did what they did: pick up a few survivors for questioning and kill or leave the rest to their fate on the sea. By noon, Thursday, November 16th, the Columbia was back in Leyte Gulf to protect the landing troops. For 10 days, they were scouted by Japanese airplanes. For the crew, it must have been monotonous. Enemy plane in area. Go to battle stations. Wait an hour for nothing to happen, then relax. Continue your routine. Enemy plane in area. Go to battle stations. Wait an hour for nothing to happen, then relax. Continue your routine. Enemy plane in area. Go to battle stations. Wait an hour for nothing to happen, then relax. Continue your routine. Even though it was monotonous, that was the point from the Japanese perspective. Lull the Allied forces into complacency. On the 18th, the monotony was broken. One of the planes finally made an attack. A dive bomber, with the sun to its back, dropped a bomb estimated to weigh 500 pounds targeting the Gem. The bomb missed the ship, hitting the water about 300 yards off the starboard quarter. The next day, the cycle began again. The Japanese were probing, identifying targets and patterns within the Allied ship formations. Japanese forces in the Philippines were desperate. Their navy was decimated. They were low on supplies, fuel, troops, and planes. Surveying this situation, their commanders increasingly turned to kamikaze attacks for deliverance. Suicide attacks by the Japanese were nothing new. However, they were mostly individual decisions and not organized, formally sanctioned actions by the Japanese command. For example, if a pilot knew that his plane was so badly damaged he was going to crash anyway, and rather than be captured or waste himself dying in the crash, he would instead fly the plane into a worthy enemy target. Now this individual behavior was being sought after, promoted, and formally organized into, quote, special attack units, end quote, by the Japanese command to prevent losing the Philippines and the war.
Japan is in grave danger. Thus, on behalf of your 100 million countrymen, I ask you this sacrifice and pray for your success. I shall watch your efforts to the end and report your deeds to the throne.
On Monday, November 27th at 11:25 a.m., the monotony of the previous 11 days was savagely broken. the Japanese chose to attack en masse. Allied ships in Leyte Gulf came under sustained attack by an estimated 20 to 30 enemy bombers and torpedo planes while the ships were refueling. The first indication of an attack was a bomb falling near the USS Denver. The bomber then crashed in the middle of the formation, shot down by Allied air cover. Columbia's guns fired on dive bombers making runs on the USS St. Louis. One of the bombers crashed on that ship's main deck and another nearly missed her on the port side. All the ships were maneuvering and changing speed to avoid the bombs and torpedoes. At the same time, they were trying to gain an advantageous firing position on the planes. 3 Japanese planes made an attack run on Columbia's port side and were shot down by her fire. 2 minutes later, the USS Colorado was hit by a kamikaze and a second narrowly missed her. 5 minutes later, 2 more planes were shot down, but one of them managed to release its torpedo, which the ships maneuvered to avoid. By 1:45, the threat was over. This was perhaps the first major attacks by the Kamikaze Corps on a group of U.S. warships. There were multiple ships hit and damaged with accompanying casualties. Columbia shot down 7 kamikazes and was credited with assisting in downing 4 others. I found it extraordinary that the ship's logs during this time show that there was almost a sense of routine to the whole event. They had just gone through this large attack, but instead of stopping and taking stock, they went on business as usual. Normal drills and exercises were held, just like any other day at sea. But the calm was not to last. 2 days later, on the 29th, at dusk, a single enemy plane attacked. The ships opened fire, but the plane made it through the barrage, passing just over Columbia's starboard bow, and crashed into the battleship USS Maryland. The Maryland was one of the dreadnought ships sunk at Pearl Harbor, but was salvaged for later service. 31 sailors were killed and another 30 were wounded. Columbia had yet again escaped being hit. Finishing her mission in Leyte Gulf, the Jim returned to anchor at Castle Reef in the Palau Islands. At least the islands were being used as a resupply point. There she joined Task Group 77.12. The task group's mission was to protect the assault landings on the Philippine island of Mindoro. This was the second phase of the Philippines invasion. With the ship resupplied and the task group assembled, they sailed on Sunday, the 10th of December, 1944. 3 days later, on the 13th, they passed through Surigao Strait for the first time, where so much fighting had taken place back in October. Sailing over the graves of the sunken Japanese ships, oil slicks could still be seen on the water's surface. There was no sympathy from the grim faces of the watchmen as they passed silently by. It could have just as easily been them rotting on the sea floor. The ship sailed on, and a short time later, they exited the strait and entered the Boral Sea. A few hours later, they rounded Negros Island and entered the Sulu Sea. This was the first time that U.S. surface ships had entered both of these seas since the Philippine Islands occupation. Japanese forces were not idle and had taken notice of the task group's progress. That same evening, they launched a suicide attack. Anti-aircraft artillery from the Jim downed one of the planes, but despite intensive fire from the ships, they could not stop them all. At 5:17 p.m., the light cruiser Nashville was hit, killing 133 and wounding 190. A short time later, another enemy plane was able to break through the wall of steel and crashed into the destroyer Harridan, sailing about 1,000 yards ahead of the Columbia. 14 sailors were killed and another 24 were wounded. The Nashville and the Harridan had to leave the task group for extensive repairs. Attacks on the task group continued the next day with varying degrees of intensity. At 4:02 p.m., the GM opened fire with its 5-inch guns on an incoming suicide plane. One of the guns turned as far as it could, trying to get a good shot off. The gun crew was so focused on the Japanese Zero, they didn't realize the gun was turned too far. They opened fire and hit their own ship. 4 sailors were killed instantly, another 34 were wounded, 5 seriously. According to the crew, there was a cam that was supposed to prevent this possibility, but it was not properly installed when the ship was built and had been a hazard all the time. There was no time to stop though. Japanese suicide attacks continued with varying intensities on the task group until the 15th, when for some reason they stopped. The Army troops were landed on Mindoro Island that morning with little opposition. On the 16th, Columbia buried her dead at sea. With the Army troops successfully landed on Mindoro, Task Group 77.12 was disbanded. The Columbia was credited with shooting down 3 enemy planes during the operation. With the Mindoro landing mission complete, the GM sailed back to Manus Island for some rest, repairs, and resupply. Christmas Day was spent stocking the ship. The all-important Christmas dinner would have to wait until the 26th. By New Year's Day, 1945, the Columbia was back at Castle Reef, Palau Islands, to join a large task organization. With the Japanese routed out of 2 of the 3 major Philippine islands, there remained only Luzon, the largest of the 3, to complete retaking the Philippines. This was going to be a huge operation, and the Columbia was going to be in the thick of it. The task group Columbia was assigned to was given the following mission. Quote, accomplish the following prior to the invasion landings on Luzon scheduled for January 9th. 1. Cover the minesweeping and underwater demolition team operations. 2. Destroy by surface and aerial bombardment enemy personnel, shore installations, and facilities along the south coast of Lingayen Gulf. 3. Furnish counter-battery fire. 4. Bombardment of beach area on 7, 8, and 9 January prior to the infantry landings. Then furnish call fire thereafter. End quote. From Leyte Gulf to the Sulu Sea, the task force was tracked by Japanese reconnaissance planes. On Wednesday the 3rd of January at 5:17 p.m., a single plane diving out of the sun hit the light carrier Omni Bay. The resulting fire soon got out of control. Her planes caught fire and ammunition magazines began to explode. She had to be abandoned and was so badly damaged she was eventually scuttled. Near midnight, the GM took on 6 officers and 112 enlisted men from the ship, 17 of whom urgently needed medical attention. While the Omni Bay burned, the task force sailed on. Throughout the night, they sailed the Mindoro Strait, and at dawn on Thursday, January 4th, entered the South China Sea. They were the first U.S. surface ships to do so since the Philippines fell to the Japanese. By this time, the Imperial Japanese forces had determined just how significant a threat the Allied task force was to them, supposing they were headed to Lingayen Gulf. It had been quiet all day, but at 4:30 that afternoon, the quiet was shattered by a concentrated attack of kamikazes. The enemy planes were flying low to avoid radar and approaching with the setting sun behind them to blind the ship's lookouts to their attack. Seemingly all the ships erupted at once with an explosion of anti-aircraft fire. It was a melee, with ships and planes each maneuvering for advantage. The Columbia managed to shoot down 2 of the planes. Despite the hail of bullets and shrapnel surrounding the ships, 5 of the kamikazes found their targets, each striking in rapid succession. There was significant damage to 3 of the ships, with associated casualties, including the death of a rear admiral. But the task force would not be deterred. They sailed on.
Ladies and gentlemen, today, in pursuance of my constitutional duty, I sent to the Congress a message on the State of the Union. And this evening I am taking the opportunity to repeat to you some parts of that message. This war must be waged, it is being waged, with the greatest and most persistent intensity. Everything we are, everything we have is at stake. Everything we are and have will be given. We have no question of the ultimate victory. We have no question of the cost. Our losses will be heavy. But we and our allies will go on fighting together to ultimate total victory. We have seen a year marked on the whole.
12 hours before President Roosevelt gave that speech, his last State of the Union address, the Columbia was conducting shore bombardments in Lingayen Gulf. Operations were going well. The bombardments were conducted on schedule and appeared to be successful. But the atmosphere was beyond tense. All day, ships in the Gulf had been under attack from Japanese planes. At 2:35 in the afternoon, a kamikaze had narrowly missed the Jim's starboard side. The plane cut so close, the enemy pilot's scalp was left on deck. When it hit the water, the plane disintegrated. Its aviation fuel was sprayed all over Columbia's bridge and surrounding structures. Quick action by the ship's damage control teams prevented the fuel from catching fire and engulfing the bridge. Through it all, only one of the crew was wounded. It had been a very close call in a string of very close calls. But the situation was ominous. The sailors knew that sunset was a prime time for enemy attack, since the attacking planes could position the sun behind them to blind observers to their approach. As expected, while the sun was setting, a large, concentrated, and persistent attack by Japanese planes developed. Earlier that day, at Mabalakot Airfield, 2nd Lieutenant Hirotomo Iwa and 1st Sergeant Tsuki Ogawa had raised their small cups of sake in a ritual toast. They stood with the other pilots of the Special Attack Unit in a half circle as their commanding officer raised his glass to toast them. Quote, "You are now as gods, free from all earthly desires. I wish you success," end quote, he told them. The pilots drank to each other, to the Emperor, then bowed low in the direction of the Imperial Palace. They wrapped white scarves around their foreheads, climbed into their Ashashi bombers, known to the U.S. as a Val. Secured under the plane was a 1,763-pound bomb. As they taxied to the runway, their fellow soldiers waved flags and shouted encouragement. Then they took off on a one-way flight to certain death. Their target was a specific ship, marked by a red X on their flight plan. They were intentionally targeting the Columbia. Lieutenant Iwa's vow stayed as close as possible to the treetops in order to avoid detection. He struggled to keep his plane under control. It was not designed to carry such a large bomb, over 3 times its normal payload. Clearing the shoreline at 5:26 p.m., approaching from the west, they identified their target less than 10 miles ahead. He gunned the engine, bringing the plane up to top speed of 267 miles per hour. They closed the distance in less than 3 minutes. The Columbia opened fire, first with her 5-inch cannons, and then, when the plane was in range, her 40-millimeter guns. The Val was seen to be hit by 40-millimeter fire on its right wing. Lieutenant Iwa calmly maneuvered his plane around the bow of the Columbia, thus avoiding the ship's intense fire. This was an experienced, professional move. Novices charged ahead with reckless abandon, but not this pilot. He knew what he was doing to avoid being shot down before his mission was complete. The Jim's guns were useless at this angle. After clearing the bow, the plane climbed sharply and so quickly the Columbia's guns could not get a bead on it. Another pro move. At about 100 feet, Lieutenant Iowa executed a loop and dove back towards the gem. He plowed himself, his radio man, the plane, and its armor-piercing 1,763-pound bomb into the aft portion of the Columbia on the port side of turret number 4. Second Lieutenant Iowa and Sergeant Ogawa had done their revulsive duty. The first explosion from the plane's fuel sent a wave of fire across the surface of the Columbia. Sailors manning the aft deck guns were either blown overboard or had to leap from the ship to avoid the inferno. The ping, ping of the armor-piercing bomb resounded as it split the steel of the main and second decks before exploding, sending a violent shudder throughout the ship. 6 holes were torn in the hull. Water began pouring in. All the sailors in the ammunition handling room of turret number 4 were killed by the explosion or drowned when that area of the ship flooded. 1 soul was able to escape by climbing over the powder cans in the storage room between turrets 3 and 4, making it to turret number 3's shell handling room before the compartment had to be sealed to prevent further flooding. If I'm correct regarding where Dad worked, the shell handling room of turret number 3, his unit was the ones who welcomed the sailor escaping the carnage in turret number 4. They were the ones who heard the shouts of those trapped in turret 4. They were the ones who had to seal the door to keep the floodwaters at bay, entombing 17 of their buddies, leaving them to their fate. It was not a decision they had time to consider, and I'm sure they didn't want to do it. The horrible situation they found themselves in demanded they close that hatch. But that kind of experience stays with you forever. There was no time to consider the magnitude of these things. They had to escape themselves. The gunpowder was on fire and could explode at any moment, tearing off the rear of the ship. This was what had happened to the USS Arizona at Pearl Harbor. Now, they were desperately trying to avoid the same fate. They rushed to join fire control efforts already underway. Much of the plane's gasoline poured into the second deck where the first aid station was. The resulting fire raged on the main and second decks. All but one of the medical team remained relatively unhurt. Survivors of the Omni Bay had been convalescing in that portion of the ship. Some of them were killed, and others sustained further injuries. Everything was happening at once. The crew worked furiously to put out the fires whose smoke was poisonous and blinding. The Japanese were attacking. Setting dead in the water, the gem was even more vulnerable. She had to be fixed now. There were bright spots, though. The gem was outfitted with one of the most effective fire control systems available. It was a highly efficient system, and within 30 minutes of the attack, all the fires were out. The flooding was contained to 9 compartments, but this caused the ship to settle 4 feet in the stern. There were alternate steering controls available, and above all, her anti-aircraft guns were fully functional. She had taken a hit and staggered, but was not down. The Columbia stayed in the fight. While her crew battled the raging fires, her guns were raging too, delivering fire of their own toward enemy planes. Her guns beautifully shot the tail off a kamikaze that was attacking the HMAS Australia. Over the previous 24 hours, a total of 21 Allied ships in Lingayen Gulf had been hit by kamikazes, some of them more than once. The ships retired overnight, to a location outside the Gulf for emergency repairs. The Columbia had suffered 77 casualties. 17 were killed in action and another 20 were missing. She had lost all of Turret 4's lower handling and magazine crew. These are people Dad would have been very familiar with, maybe even close to. Their bonds forged by common experience. Now they were dead, entombed at their station. It's believed that the flooding of these compartments together with fire control measures is all that saved the Gem from a powder magazine explosion that would have sunk her. The injured were spread all over the ship. Any place that could be used for medical purposes was commandeered. The severely injured were dying every hour. Corpsmen pulled a sheet over the dead until they could be prepared for burial. The war didn't stop, of course. Throughout the night and toward dawn the next morning, Japanese reconnaissance was surveying the situation. The Gem's crew worked tirelessly through the night to repair the ship. They were determined to continue performing the operational duties to which they were assigned. The landing troops needed them to. Work helped take their minds off the grimness of the situation. They knew they would re-enter Lingayen Gulf at daybreak, and they knew they too could be killed by any number of heinous means the next go-around. Even the supply officer kept the mess hall staff busy preparing meals. But no one was eating. Even when it was considered safe enough to leave their battle station, a few at a time, for a hot meal, no one did. There were K and C rations at each station, and those too went untouched. Everyone was overwhelmed by the danger of their circumstances. Aware they had come so very close to the powder magazine exploding, taking everyone to the bottom. Aware of their shipmates entombed in Turret 4. Aware of those missing in action. Aware of those who lay wounded and dying all over the ship. Aware of the acrid smell in the air from the charred remains of the fires. Aware of their own exhaustion. And foremost, aware they were going to do it all over again the next day. It's no wonder one of my father's sayings was, quote, "My life isn't worth 2 cents, end quote. At dawn on Sunday, January 7th, the Gem re-entered Lingayen Gulf and at 10:15 a.m. began her scheduled bombardment assignments. She was reduced to using only the first 2 6-inch turrets. Turret number 4 was destroyed, and the stern of the ship was deemed too structurally weak to risk firing turret number 3. Japanese air attacks continued, but not as intense as they had been the day before. It was as if all the best Japanese pilots had been spent, and now they were using the leftovers. But it would be foolish to discount these pilots. They may not have had the skill of those from previous encounters, but they could still get lucky, and one solid hit would still be devastating. But still, it was becoming increasingly obvious to the crew these were inferior pilots. In the afternoon, she provided close in-fire support less than 2 miles from shore. This was an especially hazardous task, given that her depth finder was out of service, and she was sagging 4 or 5 feet in the stern. Nonetheless, she performed her assigned tasks. She also took on the task of bombardment operations on areas that had originally been assigned to other ships when they were too damaged to continue. The paint on her remaining 6-inch guns began to blister from the heat of continual bombardment. Chaplains went around plugging the ears of convalescing kamikaze victims with cotton to guard against the thunder. At 5 p.m., the Columbia took on an additional 26 survivors from the USS Long and 1 critically wounded sailor from the USS Kimberly. This further strained the medical team and the already tight space on board. It was beginning to get really crowded. With the day's work complete, the Gem retired back to the entrance to the Gulf. She buried her dead, as well as those of the Omni Bay, at sea. By 10 a.m. on Monday, January 8th, the Columbia was back on station conducting her assigned bombardment operations. That same morning, those inferior Japanese pilots mentioned earlier scored a hit on the HMAS Australia. It was the fourth time that ship had been damaged by kamikazes since the Lingayen Gulf operations began. But with each of the Japanese pilots shot down or killed in their own blaze of glory, that meant there were fewer and fewer of them to harm the fleet. Columbia took a break mid-afternoon. Ammunition supplies and the forward guns were running low, so all salvageable ammunition from turrets 3 and 4 was collected and moved forward. Meanwhile, a diving team was sent to conduct an inspection of the hull. It was hoped a way could be identified to safely remove the bodies of the 17 sailors entombed in Turret 4 by the ship's force. None could be found. Once inspections were complete, shore bombardment resumed. For the ship's medical team, there was no rest for the weary. In addition to caring for the wounded, they had to perform an emergency appendectomy in the afternoon. At the end of the day, the Gem retired back to the entrance to the Gulf. At 9:30 p.m., she again buried her dead, as well as those of the Omni Bay at sea. During the night, troop transports and assault craft filled the Gulf. One sailor observed you could almost walk from one ship to the next across the Gulf without getting wet. The landing troops were preparing to invade to end the Japanese occupation of the Philippines. The cruelty of the Bataan Death March was not forgotten. Columbia would be there to cover their landing. The weather on the morning of Tuesday, January 9th was gorgeous. The temperature was in the high 70s, winds were calm, and the sea was peaceful. At any other time, it would have been a great day to spend time with the family, perhaps having a picnic on the beach. But this was no ordinary time. There was a mighty war going on, the largest the world had ever seen, and that day there was to be one of the largest troop landing operations of that war. On the order of 68,000 troops would be placed ashore. The Columbia had been in the thick of the naval prelude to the landing operation, and at considerable cost in lives and damage to the ship. Her crew was exhausted. They had been on alert and at their battle stations for almost a week. Now, at 7:45 a.m., they were back in the mix, giving themselves once more. As they were proceeding down the Gulf towards the Gem's assigned station, it came without warning. A kamikaze approached from the beach area about 2 miles distance. They tracked it at 400 miles an hour. The pilot pushing the engine so hard it should have blown a gasket. He was firing the plane's wing guns, scraping the ship as it approached. On the Columbia, there was no time to respond. In less than 30 seconds from when the plane was first sighted, the suicide pilot steered his craft and the 250-pound bomb it was carrying into the Gem's superstructure. For the Columbia's crew, it was deja vu all over again. The force of the explosion blew the 17-ton forward main battery director off the top of the ship and into the ocean, carrying its crew to the bottom of the Gulf. A 5-inch gun was knocked out, along with 4 machine guns and directors for the 40mm batteries. Bullets from the plane's strafing had done considerable damage to the exposed crew on deck. Some were killed instantly, while others lost a hand or arm. Gasoline from the accursed plane was sprayed all over the forward part of the ship, causing a flash fire. Many were severely burned. 12 minutes later, the fire was brought under control, thanks again to the ship's excellent fire control systems. But the damage was done. This time there were 17 killed, 7 missing, and 97 wounded. 3 times the Gem had been struck by kamikazes, and a total of 199 sailors were killed, wounded, or missing in action. a chaplain that had been rescued from the Omni Bay, anxiously pushed his way into the wardroom. There he found sailors in bad shape. Quote, "Most of the wounded were bleeding profusely, and I used every rag, handkerchief, and piece of tubing I could find to make tourniquets. Another man had many chest wounds from which blood spurted. He was out of his head and thrashing about wildly. I pinned him down to the deck with all my weight and endeavored to plug the wounds with gauze until the doctors could take care of him." End quote. The Jim responded to this latest attack one way: fight back. Fire control of the 6-inch guns was transferred to the aft controller. Anti-aircraft systems for the 40mm guns were rerouted and patched up to make them serviceable. Backup systems were brought online. Give up? Oh, hell no. Fight back. 18 a.m., 33 minutes after the attack, the Columbia again continued with her assigned duties, using all the serviceable weapons that could be brought to bear. She moved close to the beach and at 9:07 wrought an incredible amount of energetic violence on the landing beaches, seemingly releasing all her fury and frustration of the past few days. At 9:30, the first wave of troops hit the beach to deliver the death blow to the Japanese in the Philippines. After the shore bombings, Columbia received a direct message from the task group commander, Admiral Ohlendorf. Quote, "You have shown you have plenty of sand, Columbia." End quote. The troops ashore faced little opposition. Columbia's crew watched as wave after wave of landing craft emptied their contents on the beaches. With the landing troops ashore, the Columbia had successfully completed her mission, but at great cost. At 5:50 p.m., after standing by for call duty throughout the day, the Jim received orders to depart in convoy with the empty transports. Leaving at 6:30, Admiral Ohlendorf sent another message. Quote, "Regret to lose you at this time. The courageous conduct of your officers and crew has added to the luster of our Navy." End quote. While en route to safer harbors, the Jim's crew paused to bury their dead. At 2:30 in the afternoon on Wednesday, January 10th, the men watched solemnly as the bodies of their shipmates and friends slipped into the sea. As the hours and days went by, the stresses and strains of the first half of January began to subside, at least the outward signs. The crew regained their appetite. For a time, they were served 4 meals a day, and they rested. The Jim's first stop was for emergency repairs in San Pedro Bay, but the facilities there were not equipped to help them much. Next, she stopped in Seidler Harbor. After assessment, it was determined the damage was too extensive to safely remove the bodies trapped in Turret 4. The Jim then sailed to Pearl Harbor, arriving on Tuesday the 29th of January. Only now could the bodies be safely removed. By this time, after being in the warm tropical waters for a month, they were completely decomposed. Only the bones remained, so determining cause of death was not possible. These men were buried ashore. After the Pearl Harbor engineers completed their assessment, even their facility didn't have the necessary means to repair the gem. She was sent on to Los Angeles, arriving on Sunday, February the 11th. Damage to both man and machine was extensive. During the action in Lingayen Gulf, there had been 60 killed and 124 wounded. Remembrance of death was everywhere. Decks and bulkheads were smashed. Steel supporting girders were twisted by explosions and heat. All the machinery and living spaces aft was charred and blistered. Everything smelled like burnt rubber and fuel oil. The crew needed to rest. However, in the back of their minds, they knew they would be returning to action soon enough. Their accomplishments in saving their ship and carrying out their mission without interruption were recognized with the Navy Unit Commendation. It took 875 workers 77 days to repair the machine. Physical repairs to the injured crew would take years, and some would never be the same. 30% of the ship's damage was to the electrical system, requiring more than 50 miles of cable to replace. Arms, legs, hands are not so easily replaced. Nightmares and flashbacks cannot be so easily removed. 5 tons of welding rods were required to fix the hull. A total of 153,000 hours, over 65,554 labor days were required to complete repairs to the gem. Fixing the machine was the easy part. How do you pick up the threads of life after going through that kind of experience? Where do you even start? How do you count the labor hours? With the ship's repairs complete and the crew assembled, the gem began her shakedown and training cruises on Sunday, the 29th of April. After a brief stop in Pearl Harbor, she was back in Leyte Gulf on Saturday, the 16th of June. By the 19th of June, the gem was fully resupplied and fueled to capacity. She was headed for another battle, this time south of the equator in Borneo. The mission's objective was to capture the last major oil refinery still in Japanese control in the city of Balikpapan. The gem, like so many times before, would be conducting shore bombardments prior to the troop landings. But unlike before, one of the gem's additional responsibilities would be to serve as a supply ship. Considering the terrible events of the previous few months, this seemed to suit her crew just fine. For a week, from Sunday, June 24th until Sunday, July 1st, the gem conducted shore bombardments all day per a set schedule. There was little opposition from the Japanese to the fleet. On the night of the 25th, a 7-plane group made torpedo runs on the ships, but none of them were hit, and one of the enemy planes was shot down. That was the only opposition the ships encountered. But the minesweepers and underwater demolition teams, they took a beating. On the afternoon of the 26th, one of the minesweepers hit a mine. The gem received 35 casualties from that craft. Later the same afternoon, another minesweeper was sunk, and the Columbia received 33 survivors and 3 dead from that craft. In the evening, the 3 dead were buried at sea. The next day, while out conducting observer duties, the gem's spotter plane was hit by enemy anti-aircraft fire and slightly damaged, wounding its pilot. On the 28th, another minesweeper was sunk, and the gem received 11 survivors. Sunday, June 1st, the Australian landing troops went ashore. This was the last major amphibious landing operation of World War II. Like so many land campaigns before, the Japanese troops would not surrender and fought to the last man in a bitter struggle. The gem stood by and provided call fire all day. On Monday, her job was done, and she was ordered back to Leyte Gulf. While at anchor in Leyte Gulf, Columbia was assigned to Task Force 95. I thought it strange because this task force contained relatively small number of ships, only 2 large and 4 light cruisers and 2 destroyers. 8 ships total. That was odd to me. Their mission was to conduct anti-shipping operations in the East China Sea and to mislead the Japanese as to the next Allied assault objective. I think what they were really doing was reconnaissance. On Friday the 13th of July, the ships departed Leyte Gulf, sailing for Okinawa, where they refueled. Cautiously at first, because there was a typhoon and the seas were rough, they left Okinawa headed for China. This small group of U.S. warships were the first surface ships in the East China Sea since the war began. It speaks to just how tense the sailors were that any ship they encountered, they fired on it. The admiral had to issue orders not to fire until the unknown ship was investigated to determine if it was a friend or foe. Many Chinese vessels came under fire this way. The real drama began on the night of the 22nd. In the darkness, they made anchorage on a small island off the coast of China, listed in the Jim's logbook as Tangang Tao Island. It took me a long time to figure out where this was. There isn't a name that matches Tangang Tao Island anywhere. But after several weeks of sleuthing, I found it. They were actually at Tao Islet and butchered the translation in the record. Returning to Okinawa and using it as a supply point, a second and third sweep was made in late July and early August to completely cut off the shipping lanes between Shanghai, China, and the Japanese mainland. But there wasn't much to do. Aside from the occasional enemy plane that was shot down by combat air patrol, no enemy ships were encountered, indicating that Japan, by this stage of the war, was so weak as to be unable to send or receive supplies even to locations as close as China. But that bit about not much to do and the occasional enemy plane being shot down demonstrates just how bizarre war is. Any one of those planes could have been a kamikaze or a torpedo plane that could sink one of the ships, causing a great deal of death and destruction. But consider what the Columbia's crew had been through up to that point in the war. For them, this was just another routine, relatively quiet day at the office. Under any other circumstances, this period of cutting off shipping and shooting down planes would have been extraordinary. But they could not let their guard down even for a second, because there were many ways to die in World War II. While anchored in Buckner Bay at Okinawa, news reached the Columbia on Friday, August 10th that Japan made an initial peace offer. Emotions ran high with excitement that the war may finally be over. But that initial offer was not acceptable to the U.S. Only unconditional surrender would be accepted. It was during this period, while the U.S. and Japan were negotiating the terms of peace, that the Columbia saw her last violence of the war. On Sunday, August 12th, while anchored at Okinawa, a Japanese torpedo plane attacked the ships. The battleship USS Pennsylvania, anchored only 1,000 yards from the Jim, was hit and nearly sunk. 20 sailors were killed and another 20 were injured, including Admiral Ohlendorf. It was a stark reminder that the war was still going on. 2 days later, Japan surrendered. The war had taken a huge toll all over the world. None escaped its effects. On the order of 70 million were dead, either as a direct result of the war or from war-related diseases and famine. One decision made by Allied commanders was to bypass certain Japanese bases rather than invade and capture them directly. The Allies would cut off resupply and reinforcement to these bases for the duration of the war, neutralizing them. There remained isolated pockets of Japanese troops that had been bypassed all over the Pacific theater, and they had to be dealt with. One of those bypassed bases was Truk. Truk Atoll had been a forward operating base for the Imperial Japanese Navy since 1939. During the U.S. island hopping campaign, the base was heavily bombed and effectively destroyed in February 1944. Then the garrison isolated without hope of resupply or reinforcement for the duration of the war. These attacks left Truk with the moniker as the, quote, biggest graveyard of ships in the world, end quote. On Tuesday, September 18th, the Gem was made the flagship of Admiral G.D. Murray, commander of the Mariana Islands. She was also the headquarters ship for Brigadier General Robert Blake, United States Marine Corps, who would become the U.S. commander of the atoll occupation. Their mission was to survey the condition of the Japanese garrisoned at Truk. With all the brass on board, I suspect Dad kept a low profile during this period. He certainly didn't accompany them on the inspections. Nevertheless, it's part of his experience, and I'm willing to bet that rumors of what was found on the islands made their way among the sailors. Sailing from Guam, the inspection party reached Truk in the early morning hours of Wednesday, October 3rd. Later that morning, the Imperial Japanese Navy commander came on board to report on the progress of Truk's demilitarization. They were questioned extensively in the wardroom, all the while enjoying as many American cigarettes as they could smoke. During the interrogations, the Japanese revealed that the garrison of about 42,000 troops were starving. The last time they received resupply had been over a year ago in June 1944, when a ship had run the blockade and brought 600 tons of rice. Since that time, approximately 4,000 Japanese troops had died of disease and malnutrition, with those remaining in very bad condition. Between Thursday, October 4th, and Sunday the 6th, 4 of the atoll's islands were inspected. The inspection party found the naval base shattered. Broken skeletons of planes littered the ramp, from which hundreds of Japanese pilots had left to scout the sea lanes and cut off American shipping earlier in the war. Only 5 planes had escaped destruction on the whole atoll. The entire area was decimated. It was hard to believe this had once been the home to the mighty Japanese Imperial Fourth Fleet. Only intensive cultivation of almost every inch of arable land saved the remaining Japanese troops from being completely starved out. But with bugs and worms infesting the current sweet potato crop, the Japanese garrison were severely malnourished. Rank upon rank of starving soldiers lined up along the route for the inspection party. Men with ankles as thin as skinny wrists, with sunken-in chest, and with every rib showing sharply. There was little left to suggest this had once been a major hub of the Japanese imperial war machine. The entire atoll that had once bristled with huge guns, pillboxes, and all manner of war implements was now a hollow shell. But it struck the inspectors that the island was relatively undeveloped, considering it had been in Japanese hands since 1914. There were more than 2,000 construction battalion men on the island, but there was only one poorly maintained road, and it didn't even go all the way around the island. When asked about this, the Japanese officer would only respond that it was carelessness on their part. It was as if he understood that the lack of infrastructure, when they had 25 years to build it up, was lacking on their part. This was surprising considering the Japanese reputation for industry. A visit to the hospital on the island revealed the urgent nature of the situation for the island garrison. Numerous patients suffered from severe malnutrition and associated diseases. Interestingly, the report goes on to state that there were about 12,000 natives on the atoll, and they were faring far better than the Japanese and were relatively healthy. The report does not state why. With the Truk inspections over, the Gem sailed back to Guam for repairs. And when that was done, she headed back to the U.S. mainland on Wednesday, October 31st, 1945. She was going home. By November, she called on the West Coast for a brief time before passing through the Panama Canal and arriving back in Philadelphia on Wednesday, December 5th. It was finally over. The ship was back where it all began back in 1942. By early January 1946, Dad found himself at the naval station in Jacksonville, Florida. Why they just didn't stop in Jacksonville on the way up to Philadelphia, I don't know. The military works in mysterious ways sometimes. On Sunday, January 13th, it was time to go home. The Navy paid him $14.14 in salary and $21.40 for travel expenses. Dad had been in the Navy for 2 years and 26 days. How do you pick up the threads of a normal life after going through the extraordinary and terrifying events that he did? Where do you start? I think he did the best he could under the circumstances. He kept himself busy, mostly with his love of the outdoors. Eventually, he got married, and after a few years, I came along. He lived simply and without any pretense. As far as I know, he didn't attend any of the Columbia's reunions or communicate with his shipmates. He refused to discuss the war. How could he possibly convey to someone who hadn't been there what it was like? Instead, he chose to keep it all to himself, for his own reasons, until the day he died.